Before we start, you're either going to need to have played about 100 hours of video games or just generally not care about spoilers, because in this one, we're going to be talking about heavy spoilers for Baldur's Gate 3 up to the beginning of Act 3, Fire Emblem Three Houses Azure Moon, and all the way to ending C and D of Nier Automata. And of course you'll have time to play all of those by the time the spoiler countdown ends, right? Skip to these times to bypass the spoilers for each game. Alright, 3, 2, 1, let's begin. Abrupt character development is something that most writers would want to avoid. After all, it can come across as lazy and rushed in a lot of cases. Oh, you mean to say that this guy's entire personality trait of vengeance and murder have been overturned because another guy told him that the person who started this vengeance spree was actually kinda sad when he orphaned the guy? It breaks the immersion. Revelations can definitely happen, and they'll certainly vastly change some parts of the character's worldview. But I feel like the problem arises not from the revelation itself, but the setup and how the characters react after their entire worldview has been utterly demolished. To figure out how it's been done and what we can learn from these attempts, let's get plotting. Starting off, what am I defining as a revelation arc? For this video, a revelation arc will mean any character arc that is brought upon swiftly by a revelation or discovery that fundamentally changes or adds context to the character's prior goal or mentality, often sending them on an entirely opposite trajectory than they were previously going, but not in all cases, as we'll soon discuss. Normally, character arcs have several failures, reflections, obstacles, and small victories before reaching a point where the character truly solidifies their growth or deterioration with a decisive action or decision that their pre-arc self wouldn't have taken. It's gradual, but there are still checkpoints that show where the character is in terms of their development, whether those are shown through failures or successes, and these checkpoints are the map for the arc, ensuring that the character will be on schedule for their arc's earned conclusion. So, in terms of these types of traditional character arcs, revelation arcs essentially break the rules of what makes the arcs compelling and cathartic, when they're done in a certain way at least. For this, we'll start off with the fastest yet least efficient version of this arc, where there's little to no build-up. It can work in theory, but there's still quite a bit of room for improvement. Part 1. No build-up. Okay, I lied. There is another spoiler warning. Episode 1 of the Loki series, because oh boy is there some rapid character development in this one. Skip to this time to avoid spoilers. For anyone who hasn't seen or doesn't intend to watch the Loki show, the first episode essentially takes Loki, god of mischief and king of having about 1,000 arcs throughout the MCU's runtime, to a place that oversees time and also apparently doesn't realize that it's supposed to look sci-fi instead of like a beige office building. The version of Loki in this show is from the first Avengers movie. You know, the movie where he was the main antagonist who murdered an insane amount of people and tried to unleash an alien genocide on New York. In the normal order of events, Loki is then gradually redeemed throughout the rest of the Marvel movies that he's in. The arc isn't perfect, and I personally think the resolution to his arc was kinda weak in the context of him being a witty deceiver, but it works well enough. He's still one of my favorite Marvel characters. So, with that context, here's what they end up doing in the actual show. After he's taken to the time place, keep in mind this is like a day after he terrorized New York, he's shown a little video of basically all his scenes in the rest of the Marvel movies. You know, I think the writers might have taken show don't tell a bit too literally here. He sees how his actions led to his mother's murder, how his father eventually says how he loves both his sons equally, I swear, Thor definitely isn't favored at all, and Loki ends up ultimately seeing his death scene. Wow, Mobius really should have put a spoiler warning on that. After watching the SparkNotes version of his character development, Loki cries and monologues about his internal conflict and character flaws. But let's start with the stuff that I actually thought was fairly well written, with the plot point, setup, and reaction. First, the setup, albeit rushed, did hit at some of his internal conflicts. His need for control and grand purpose, stemming from the utter lack of control over his life and being a shadow compared to Thor's birthright and power. The idea that everything he did was simply intended and scripted rather than from his own free will and strategies is definitely gonna mess with him a bit. And this brings us to the second well-done part of this scene, where he gets defensive and outright denies these internal conflicts, instead projecting that powerlessness and meaninglessness onto people he says are below him. There's a development scene, narrative-wise, not necessarily in terms of character development, where he tries to escape and learns a bit more about this alternate realm place that he's trapped in. The fact that he takes action here only to ultimately realize how frivolous his attempts are is a great way of shattering his hope that this is all a lie, and further leading him to believe that he is truly just a pawn of fate, the worst thing he can imagine in terms of his internal conflict, which is another good segue into him watching the rest of the video, as he really has no other options left and is curious about where his fate leads now that the video seems more credible. There isn't going to be an abundance of praise for the movie watching scene itself, so let's skip to the reaction scene. I kinda like his mini breakdown after the movie, realizing that the idea of glorious purpose could never be achieved, which is honestly a really good breaking point for the character. The more emotionally vulnerable a character is, the easier it'll be to instill or at least nudge them in the direction of change, as they won't be able to defend against it as effectively. The story beat right after this shows him fighting back against a guard and then doing the very in-character thing of just kinda tormenting her for a minute before needing to actually sit with his thoughts and all that he's learned from the Convenient Life movie. This scene provides a good deal of dynamic mood shifts that feel natural and keep the scene engaging, and the small fight scene where Loki takes control of whatever he can, namely the guard, is a good way to ease the story into the final stage of the character arc speedrun. Since control is such a big thing for this character, the reaction serves as the last bit of control he can cling to before having to accept reality. And that's where the problems start. This dialogue is aggressively out of character. Sure, everything he's saying makes sense, but I'd say it's a pretty universal rule to avoid characters perfectly pinpointing their internal conflicts and flaws and then being able to eloquently express exactly what those character flaws are, unless the development has entirely earned it, in which case you wouldn't even need a scene like this because the audience would already know what these flaws and conflicts are. Yes, you need a character to learn what their flaws are in order to overcome them, but not through a movie. Come on, even Persona 4 had less obvious this is my character flaw scenes. I would go more in depth on what makes a good this is my flaw scene, but that's a different topic for a different video. Alright, I entirely understand how fun it is to force your characters to break and no longer be able to avert their eyes from the harm their actions have caused, but you've got to back it up with something. Character arcs are built on decisions and actions that prove certain things about the character's mentality and morality or lack thereof. While he's watching the rest of the movie, Loki isn't able to make any decision that can show his growth. Of course, sometimes inaction can be a decision on its own, but it has to be intentional. For instance, a character whose main flaw is recklessness or refusal to accept that some things can't be changed might have a resolution or major decision where they accept that the best option is to do nothing. However, this doesn't really work with Loki because watching a movie is a very passive thing. He made the decision to watch it, but the only reactions he could give after that point were facial expressions. For an example of how decision dictates growth, let's take a look at Baldur's Gate 3, a game that has thoroughly taken over all of my free time. I'm only going to say vague Act 3 spoilers for this segment, so you should probably be fine to watch this part, but here's the time that you can skip to if you want to be extra careful to avoid anything about the game. So, Astarion and Loki are basically the same guy. Manipulative, magnificent bastards who desperately need to be in control due to their tragic backstories. In Act 3 of Baldur's Gate, there's a huge decision in Astarion's storyline that will drastically change his character, and the reason it works is because the decision is deeply tied to his past traumas and the internal conflict of needing control. You can see hints of how the decision is affecting him before it happens. He wants the power that this decision can give him, but it would be at a cost that he actually, for once, cares about. Not to mention that gaining the power and paying the price would be by his hand, which makes the decision complex instead of, hey, do you want to stop being evil? And it's a shame that they didn't do something similar for Loki. But can the Loki approach work? Before writing this script, I likely would have said no. But then I recalled a certain beloved trope of mine, or at least one that I've accidentally written far too many times, which leads us to Part 2, Character Development Comas. A character development coma is when a character goes through an arc while unconscious, usually in some sort of dream or alternate realm of consciousness. These character development comas are essentially revelation arcs in a tidy package of dream-delivered character growth or corruption, so it's only right that I at least mention it. These are very useful due to the trope's ability to blatantly illustrate the character's internal conflicts and force them to face these parts of themselves, often through great struggle in the attempt to disprove that these flaws and fears exist, or trying to run from them. But if you've ever had a scary dream before, you're probably going to know that running from the spooky dream monster rarely works. These development comas work because the rules of reality can be altered to create the perfect environment for change, and, in line with the topic of this video, the perfect environment for showing the character the reality that they were trying to ignore. A revelation, you could say. With the Loki example, the main reasons that the character development movie didn't work were that it 1, didn't involve character action, and 2, robbed the show of genuinely interesting ways that they could have explored the development. Think of how much more interesting this episode would have been if the TVA had instilled all of Loki's future memories into his head, maybe causing him to pass out so that he could be an active participant in his dreams and future memories rather than just watching. His fears and insecurities could take hold and warp reality, creating new nightmare scenarios that become entangled with the actual MCU canon. The dream would make it feel real to him, and the audience would get a better insight into how he deals with these nightmares and truths. But I'm getting a little off topic. The point of character development, especially in the speedrun variety, is to have the character come to a new understanding of their conflicts through some means of action, regardless of whether those actions took place in the real world or in a dream. But even then, there must be a follow-through action or actions that prove that a change has indeed been made, which leads us to Part 3, Reaction. When I'm plotting out a chapter, episode, or story, I always have a section titled, "Oh yeah? Prove it." which is where the character goes up against a challenge or obstacle that they would have otherwise not been able to face before their character development or revelation. The contemplation part is now mostly over, so that the character can make a decision to verify that a change has occurred. There are multiple ways this can be done. It can end in tragedy, triumph, or some sort of bittersweet half-victory, or some other variation of these. The most important piece to this Prove It section, though, is that the character's decision illustrates the heart of their change or failure to change. Thus, we get into the Baldur's Gate 3 spoilers, again. Skip to this time to avoid them. So, Shadowheart. I never disliked her in Act 1 or 2, but she really became one of my favorites after the Gauntlet of Shar. For anyone who doesn't know, Shadowheart is a cleric who worships Shar, Lady of Loss and Sorrow, and Shadowheart definitely wasn't indoctrinated into a cult, she just gave up her memories because she wanted to, don't worry about it. But anyway, during the Gauntlet of Shar, Shadowheart has the chance to become a Dark Justiciar, which means proving her loyalty to Shar and climbing up the cult's, religion's, ranks. But to do this, she'll need to kill the Night Song, daughter of Selûne, the opposing goddess to Shar. Shadowheart can be convinced not to kill the Night Song Aelin in a few different ways, ultimately throwing the magical Shar Spear into the void if she finally realizes and accepts that Shar, Lady of Darkness, is a little shady. After some other plot stuff, Aelin sheds light on Shadowheart's mostly forgotten past of being supposedly attacked by a wolf and supposedly saved by Shar's worshippers. She learns that this wolf was actually her, druid father, and that, wow, she's actually been lied to this whole time, who could have guessed? From here, Shadowheart cuts her hair and dyes it white, in this version of events anyway, and turns against Shar in the pursuit of finding her parents. This arc is honestly pretty well done. It answers questions about Shadowheart's past, shows her the harsh reality of her Sharan indoctrination, and gives her character so much more depth. But how did this work? The arc happened so swiftly, so what makes it effective in ways that some other arcs aren't? Well, I think it primarily lies in the reaction and what the truth actually meant for her character. Rather than just immediately accepting the shattered worldview, Shadowheart needed time to process what she had learned, contemplating the lie she had been fed her whole life. If you try to talk to her before a certain point after this, she will say that she isn't in the mental state to have a conversation and that she needs to hear what Aelin has to tell her before she'll be able to fully digest the truth. This is great. Not for Shadowheart, the poor girl, but it fixes one of my biggest problems with this type of arc when done poorly, and that's when the character does a complete 180 the minute they learn of this revelation. Yes, Shadowheart does make a pretty sharp turn away from Shar after this, but it's after she's had time to process and become her own person, even if that time period was brief. Not to mention how her post-revelation self almost felt like, and keep in mind I say this as a good thing, when a 7th grader realizes they have 2% more freedom and now goes fully into their rebellious goth phase. I say this as a positive because, like edgy middle schoolers, once you start finding a little bit of a voice for yourself after so long having depended on someone else to guide your every decision, the experimentation phase of trying on new personalities and styles can go a little overboard. But it's because there's this new freedom that allows for that exploration, which is quite similar to Shadowheart's severed loyalty from Shar. She was able to finally figure out who she was when being a cleric of Shar isn't her defining trait anymore. It also helps that Shadowheart is an actual adult who is probably past her cringe phase. The context matters so much here. Reversing the brainwashing is what gives Shadowheart the room to make her own decision about who she'll follow, so it only makes sense that she'll follow Selûne. Following Selûne is an active stance of defiance against Shar, which also brings back the idea of character decision marking the steps of growth. Another component in the reaction's favor is that Shadowheart was already uncertain about her past, and it obviously distressed her. So, what about the setup? They definitely emphasized Shadowheart's undying loyalty to Shar throughout the game, and especially during the Gauntlet. But the way they did it makes the arc play out like a tragedy despite it still being positive growth. See, tragedy tends to follow a certain order of events that takes away the main thing the protagonist wanted or was striving for, usually having the character themselves be the accidental perpetrator of rendering their hopes and dreams impossible. Or they get what they want, but it plays out in a tragic way where they lose something that they were not prepared to part with. When Shadowheart throws the spear into the abyss, she has stopped herself from ever becoming the thing she spent her entire life in pursuit of, a Dark Justiciar. The reason it had a similar format to tragedy is because the audience knows that realizing Shar's deceit could be a very real possibility, yet the even darker decision would be to have Shadowheart actually fulfill this desire and kill Aelin. It creates unease about her decision would be, or at least it would if you couldn't reload the save file, assuming you're not playing on honor mode. Part 4, Staying in Character. Shadowheart's revelation arc certainly wasn't perfect, but one of the best things about it was that Shadowheart stayed in character throughout the whole game. Going back to the Loki example, his entire personality fundamentally changed after he watched the video, or rather, the skeleton of his personality changed. He was still witty and saying that he's a genius and better than everybody else, and I did like a few lines of dialogue here and there, but the underlying motives behind his character voice became wholly different. The skeleton of his character was written to be a hero concerned with saving people, which would be fine if there was time to actually mend his moral compass, but the Revelation arc wasn't implemented in a way that could achieve this. And this leads me to another point, which is the source of the revelation. This is by far the most important part of the Revelation arc because, well, I mean, it's in the name. Shadowheart's revelation fundamentally broke the crux of her beliefs. The reason behind her goals was uprooted, meaning that her goals had to change, otherwise she wouldn't be acting in line with the revelation. There was a definitive breaking point that was very well established as the thing driving the character. For two other examples, let's look at Nier Automata and Fire Emblem Three Houses Azure Moon. Skip to this time to avoid spoilers, and sorry, but I'm gonna be talking about these two roughly at the same time, so you'll have to have played both. I talked about this in the first video I ever made, please don't watch it, but the reason that sudden corruption arcs in these games work so well was because there was ample setup that explored the primary thing or things that each angsty murder boy cared about or was motivated by above all else. For 9S, all of endings A and B were a setup. They showed how much he cared about 2B, as well as established several parallel narratives in side quests and through the first two antagonists, Adam and Eve, showing thematically what happens when somebody loses the person who brings meaning to their life. When 9S loses 2B, alongside learning that humanity never survived, which was another hit to his core motivations, his swift moral decay makes sense because he has lost literally everything, including his sanity now too. There's nothing left to drive him apart from revenge, and his reliance on revenge brings him further down this corruption arc. For Dimitri in Fire Emblem, it's a slightly different motive. His negative arc isn't spurred by losing something, but rather through learning and misinterpreting new information. Throughout the first half of the game, you come to learn that beneath Dimitri's princely polish, he's actually quite ruthless and vengeful, which we get to see little glimpses of before he totally snaps. During this, we also learn that his family died in the tragedy of Duscur, a massacre in which he was the only survivor and had to watch his parents and best friends brutally murdered. This event spurred his inner rage and vengeance quest, which he's able to mostly hide throughout the first half of the game. His main goal is to find the perpetrators and decapitate them. However, a minor antagonist from the first half, the Flame Emperor, who Dimitri suspects of being involved in the tragedy, ends up being his basically stepsister. The fact that Edelgard, the Flame Emperor, was Dimitri's main suspect for killing her own mother, as well as Dimitri's father and friend, was just a bit much for him to take in. And the fact that he finally had somebody who he could take his rage out on was just enough to cause an honestly fantastic mental breakdown scene where he fully goes over the edge. This revelation and breaking point works so well because the game presented Dimitri's corruption arc in a way that asks the questions of when is he gonna break and what's gonna sever the last threads of the princely facade, and adequately sets up that this breaking point is going to involve information about the tragedy of Duscur, as that's the main motivator behind his goal in declining mental health. But you see, Dimitri actually had two character moments that sparked drastic change. This one was the catalyst for the negative arc, but a second and a bit more rushed revelation arc ends up bringing him out of this murdery state and into a quick redemption. After 5 years of horribly murdering Empire soldiers during the war, in the pursuit of decapitating Edelgard, Dimitri ends up reuniting with the rest of the main cast and the protagonist Byleth, who he thought had died. For the majority of this post-time skip half of the game, Dimitri essentially refuses to talk to anybody unless he's threatening them or saying that they're going to ultimately betray him. But it's still apparent that he cares about these people, especially Rodrigue, his childhood friend Felix's father. And after a certain fight, this girl Fleisch goes absolutely ballistic and screams about how she'll avenge her brother who Dimitri killed. Well, technically Byleth mercy killed him because they were getting worried about the absolutely atrocious ways that Dimitri was saying he was going to kill the guy. But anyway. Before Fleisch can kill Dimitri, Rodrigue jumps in front of the way to buy Byleth some time to kill the girl. After this, Rodrigue tells Dimitri that no one died for the prince, but rather what they believed in. Later on, when Dimitri decides to sneak out to kill Edelgard himself, Byleth stops him because there's a darkest hour that really needs to happen. Which is honestly probably one of my favorite scenes in the game, despite how rushed the redemption was. Regardless, Dimitri laments a bit about what he should live for, if not for vengeance, which is when Byleth repeats Rodrigue's words and gives the very vague but somehow helpful advice of living for what he believes in, and that sorta resolves the whole thing. The second revelation, though I like it most, isn't written quite as strong as the initial breaking point, however it still checks the boxes it needed to. Hit one of the character's greatest internal conflicts or flaws, give them time to ponder, and then take action. Tying these examples back to revelations, the change in character is abrupt, brought upon by one or two major events or discoveries that disprove or challenge the character's prior core beliefs or whatever they hold closest to their heart. But this can't all be established in the revelation scene itself, otherwise it wouldn't be believable and would end up feeling forced. Therefore, Part 5, Setup. Yeah, a little out of order here, but we'll just say that this is the last section because you needed to understand what the setup had to set up. Let's go with that. Anyway, for all this talk of revelations and reactions, it's also important to acknowledge that despite the entire gist of revelation arcs being that they happen abruptly, they still require setups. But these setups can be far simpler than what a longer or more in-depth character arc would require. With the two prior examples, the main setups are the motive and breaking point. What's the character aiming for, why, and what will losing the core worldview mean to them? And if you wanted to add a bit of extra believability, give the character a few scenes of doubt before the revelation where they question their views before brushing away those scary notions. But like I said, the setup can be subtle. Part 6, Summary. Character development is a nuanced topic, and there are so many ways to go about it. But if you're going for the character development speedrun achievement, here are a few steps that can make the process just a bit easier. First, the only setup you really need for this type of arc is thoroughly establishing the character's deepest desires and flaws throughout the pre-revelation narrative. We need to know that this revelation is going to cut deep and specifically target the character's core. Next, ensure that the revelation is responded to with action or actions that will solidify the character's decision and new trajectory. Third, the reaction. Give them time to process and come to terms with their new worldview or view of themselves. It doesn't need to be super long, just long enough to show the audience that this was truly a major change in the character's life. I should also probably say, as per my obligatory, writing style is unique to the specific story and situation, therefore there is no definitive rule that can ever be broken. Revelation arcs are just one way that you can write a character arc. It can be utilized quite well in certain situations, but there are times when a longer, slow burn arc will be more effective. This certainly shouldn't be viewed as an easy out if a character arc didn't have a strong plan or vision. However, packing the heart and soul of an arc into one grand revelation scene has the potential to be one of the most memorable scenes in a story. But it's all down to the execution. And with that, I think I've rambled quite long enough. After all, there's more Baldur's Gate for me to play. Happy writing! Bye!